Extinction is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as a situation in which something no longer exists. While this term has been applied to a variety of settings, it usually relates to the extinction of animals. The day the dinosaurs died is known as the KT extinction event. In a way, extinction is nature's way of removing designs of animals that no longer work. However, since the emergence of humans onto our planet, the rate of extinction has increased dramatically. Initially, scientists argue we mainly sped up the extinction of animals that were already on their way out, such as mammoths. However, we would later begin purposely hunting animals to extinction, like the wolves and bears of Britain and the bison of North America, the latter coming so close that only 600 individuals remained, and the North American bison will only be brought back through the conservation work of zoos and government support. But once an animal is gone, it's gone. There is no alternative, no plan B. Once the final individual dies, that species is lost to the world. Examples of this are the great auk and the Tasmanian tiger, animals that were hunted to extinction, with the last individuals dying in the worst ways possible, with the last pair of great auks thought to be killed by an Icelandic fisherman with a club, and the last Tasmanian tiger dying in a zoo in the 30s, and the only reason it died when it did is because the zoo it was kept in forgot to bring it inside for the night. These stories for decades have driven conservation efforts to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. But in a world where estimates predict that we will lose 30% of all of Earth's biodiversity by 2050, in the face of this, there are those who are now looking at cloning as a failsafe and a way to introduce diversity to populations so they don't suffer from a genetic bottleneck, making them more susceptible to disease. However, technical barriers in this field have been immense. Nevertheless, the word de-extinction entered the public consciousness in 2002 when scientists attempted to clone an extinct species of ibex called the Iberian ibex. They succeeded for a time, as in 2003 a female Iberian ibex was born. However, it died 3 minutes later due to deformities in its lungs. At this point, the concept of de-extinction retreated back into the realm of scientific discussion as the media moved on to discuss other issues, and that was until March 2025, when Colossal Bioscientists revealed that they had taken the genes that gave the woolly mammoth its snow survival capabilities and placed them into a pair of mice, the result of which was the woolly mice, showing the world how far bioengineering had come in the last 20 years. Many of us thought this would be the last we would hear on this subject for a good few months, possibly many years. That was until March 7th of 2025, when a video was released by Colossal Bioscientists, and what it showed was truly astonishing. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what Colossal Bioscientists claim to be the howl of the dire wolf, an extinct species of canid that went extinct around 12,000 years ago. This has reignited the debate surrounding de-extinction, with many arguing that the money spent on the project would be better spent on retaining current species. Others claiming that humanity is now playing God with powers it fully doesn't understand. For the rest of this video, I will go over the arguments for and against de-extinction, as well as assess whether or not these individuals are truly dire wolves. But before we go any further, in the description, I've linked the sources I've read and referenced to make this script and video. I recommend you check them out, as they're an interesting read and will as a result increase your knowledge on this subject. Anyway, let's begin with the arguments for de-extinction, which are as follows: morality, increasing biodiversity, and the application in non-extinct animals. The morality argument is easy to understand. Humans have driven thousands of species of animals to extinction. So, if we can undo some of the damage our ancestors have done, it is our responsibility to do so. And to summarise it up in a nice quote, did we not play God when we drove these animals to extinction? This also links to the second argument, which is to boost biodiversity. A lot of these animals which we drove to extinction are what we consider keystone species. Animals, usually at the top of the food chain, that keep everything in check, and the loss of these animals throws the ecosystem into turmoil. Let me give you an example. During the 1920s, grey wolves were driven to extinction in Yellowstone National Park in the USA. The loss of these animals meant that the large carnivores, which had kept the herbivore populations in check, were all gone. As a result, there were no predators for their prey, leading to excessive population growth and grazing, and as a result, degradation of their environment. During this period, you saw very few new trees growing because, with no one to hunt them, the large herbivores, usually elk, ate all the saplings and grass. The effect on the ecosystem led many animals that relied on these habitats to be driven to local extinction in Yellowstone. However, in the 1990s, grey wolves were once again reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in order to restore the ecosystem. The results were immediate. Firstly, the elk population dropped to a more natural rate, as prior to the wolves' introduction, it was thought that it was as high as 17,000 individuals. Now, it's thought to be around 4,000, a more healthy number. Also, the land that was once overgrazed has now been restored, and many of the smaller animals which rely on long grass have now returned to Yellowstone National Park, and the ecosystem has become much stronger as a result. Another example of what can happen to an ecosystem when a keystone species goes extinct is in Tasmania. Tasmania is different to much of Australia for one reason. Dingoes never got to Tasmania. What this meant was that the ecosystem had the Tasmanian tiger as its apex predator. Whereas on the mainland, the tiger had been outcompeted by dingoes, and also to a lesser extent humans, on Tasmania they were still the kings. But when Tasmanian tigers were hunted to extinction during the 19th century, this role was left vacant. The result was the same thing that happened in Yellowstone: an explosion of the herbivore population, overgrazing, and environmental degradation. Thus, people that argue for the Tasmanian tiger's de-extinction make the point that its reintroduction will reverse much of the damage to Tasmania's ecosystem, like it did in Yellowstone, making Tasmania a more ecologically stable and balanced region. The third argument is less talked about, and that's the application of this technology to our current species. What this means is that what we learn from cloning extinct animals could be applied to our current extant animals. An example of this would be the red wolf, a lesser-known subspecies of the grey wolf found in the southern USA. Currently, there's thought to be only 17 wild individuals. However, there is a breeding population in captivity of 241. The problem is, they're suffering from a genetic bottleneck. Basically, they're all too related. And also, they suffer from hybridization with coyotes. Now, whilst de-extinction and the technology it develops can't deal with the hybridization issue, what it can do is help to resolve the genetic bottleneck, because the danger of a genetic bottleneck is it increases the possibility of a disease wiping out an animal, in this case, the red wolf. And with the risk of extinction being quite high, the application of cloning methods to these animals could mean that the risk of extinction decreases. Colossal Bioengineering claims that they've already successfully used this technology to clone 4 genetically unique red wolf puppies, which they claim will increase biodiversity by 25% in captive breeding populations, thus alleviating the genetic bottleneck. However, there are those who criticise de-extinction for the following reasons, with the main argument being that the money spent on de-extinction would be better spent in supporting already existing populations, wildlife, which would help better protect the existing ecosystem. Another argument is the unpredictability of genes. Effectively, this argument posits that if you give an animal a gene to affect its behaviour, it may have unintended consequences elsewhere in the animal. For example, an animal could grow another tail, but the broader issue is that this could affect how the animal interacts with the ecosystem, possibly causing more damage than there would be if the animal didn't exist. Another argument against de-extinction is that the ecosystem these animals would be introduced to have already adapted to life without these animals, and their reintroduction would possibly cause even more upheaval. An example of this could be the Siberian tundra and the debate around reintroducing the mammoth, an animal that went extinct nearly 4,000 years ago, and the Siberian ecosystem has already adapted to life without the mammoth. There is also another aspect of de-extinction we must discuss. Due to the age of many of these species, their biomaterial is heavily damaged. As a result, I've had to take some liberties in how they de-extinct animals. So, with the dire wolf, they altered 14 genes, which gave these wolves their much larger skull size and bigger coat. Some scientists would argue this doesn't make these 3 wolves dire wolves, as dire wolves split from grey wolves more than 2.5 million years ago. And so, the wolves Romulus and Remus, named after the mythological brothers who founded Rome, but before this were nurtured by a she-wolf as children, and a she-wolf called Khaleesi, named after the title given to Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, are not truly dire wolves. Rather, A better term would be grey wolves with direwolf-like characteristics. As you can tell, this is a subject that is still being heavily debated, and it really depends on who you ask whether these animals are truly direwolves or simply large grey wolves. Ultimately, these three will never be reintroduced to the wild, and will spend their days in the large compound somewhere in the United States. But with the recent announcement of these three animals, what this has done, once again, reopened the debate on de-extinction, the result of which is yet to be determined. Anyway, I'd appreciate you sharing your opinions in the comments, but I make the disclaimer that let's just try and keep things civil. A list with all the links to the sources I've used in this video will be in the description. And in your screen right now, you should see a link to a video on a real dinosaur, the cassery. With all that said, I thank you for watching. This is a bit different than what I normally do, but I hope you stick around to find out more about nature, and I'll see you in the next one.